Every summer, my family rented a cabin deep in the woods of northern Michigan. I was 12 the year it happened, old enough to want a little independence, but still young enough to rely on my parents. My family consisted of me, my older sister Emily, and our parents. That year, we went with my dad's college friend Mike, his wife Sarah, and their 2 daughters Jenna and Kate, who were about Emily's age. The cabin was perched on the edge of a lake, with a long, crooked dock stretching out over the water. Behind it, dense pines pressed up against the property line like a green wall. Usually, we spent the afternoons kayaking or fishing while the moms stayed behind to cook dinner or relax on the deck. But one afternoon, the dads decided to stay back to help fix a leak in the bathroom, and Emily, Jenna, Kate, and I were left to entertain ourselves. It was Emily who suggested we explore the woods behind the cabin. Jenna and Kate agreed enthusiastically, and even though I wasn't thrilled about trudging through the undergrowth, I tagged along. After all, I didn't want to be the lame little brother who stayed behind. About 20 minutes into our hike, we came across an old wire fence. A faded sign hung loosely from one of the posts. The letters were weathered and peeling, but the word restricted was still visible. Emily shrugged it off and said it was probably just for property lines or an old hunting ground. Jenna pointed out a narrow path leading deeper into the woods, one that seemed frequently used despite the no entry sign. The 4 of us squeezed through a gap in the fence and started walking. The deeper we went, the more the air felt wrong. It wasn't a smell or a sound, more like the weight of the atmosphere had changed, the kind of heavy silence where even the birds refused to sing. Eventually, we stumbled upon a clearing, and that's when we saw it, a makeshift campsite. 2 old canvas tents sat sagging under the weight of pine needles and light drizzle. A rusty metal cooler lay overturned nearby with beer cans scattered around it. Something about it felt staged, like whoever had been there wanted to leave just enough behind to make it look abandoned. Emily, always the bold one, walked up to one of the tents and unzipped it halfway before recoiling with a sharp gasp. She didn't say anything, but her face went pale. Jenna and Kate were already backing away when I, curious and stupid, stepped forward and peeked inside. There was a person lying there. Their body was covered in an old sleeping bag, but their face was visible. The skin was pale and waxy, the eyes half-lidded but frozen open. And yet, something about them felt off. Like they weren't quite dead, but not exactly alive either. We turned and bolted. Branches slapped against my face, and the cold air burned in my lungs. I tripped once. Jenna helped me up, and we kept running until we burst out of the woods and into the clearing near the cabin. When we told our parents, they didn't believe us. They thought we were making up stories to entertain ourselves. My dad even said, "You kids have been watching too many horror movies." But Emily was adamant. She begged them to come look, to at least check if someone needed help. Finally, to placate us, the dads grabbed flashlights and led us back to the spot. Except the campsite was gone. The clearing was empty. No tents, no cooler, no beer cans, not even footprints in the damp soil. Just pine needles and silence. Dad shone his flashlight around and said, "See? Nothing here. You kids probably stumbled across an old hunting camp and let your imaginations run wild." But I knew what I'd seen. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the frozen face in the tent. Around 2 in the morning, I decided to get up for a glass of water. As I passed the window in the living room, I froze. In the moonlight, barely visible through the fog, I saw someone standing at the edge of the tree line. The figure was still, their heads slightly tilted, as if they were watching the cabin. I couldn't make out their features, but something about their posture felt familiar. The next morning I told Emily, but she just shook her head and said she hadn't slept either. None of us had. The rest of the trip felt tense. The dads tried to keep the mood light with jokes and fishing trips, but every creak of the cabin or rustle in the woods set me on edge. The last night, just before we packed up to leave, Emily came to sit beside me on the porch. "You saw them too, didn't you?" she asked softly. I nodded. Neither of us said anything after that. We just sat there, staring out at the dark tree line, where someone was still watching. It's been over a decade since that summer, and I still think about the body in the tent, about the missing campsite, about the figure in the woods. I'll never know what we stumbled upon that day, but sometimes, when I'm in a quiet place, I still feel it, that heavy silence, like someone is watching. Before the next story, if you're new to the channel, make sure to subscribe so that you don't miss any of these terrifying stories. A few years ago, my buddies and I decided to take a trip to a beach resort in Mexico. It was one of those all-inclusive deals. Pools, free drinks, ocean views, the works. The resort was massive, almost like its own little town. Every night was loud and filled with music, drinking, and late-night adventures. But one night still haunts me. Part of our package included access to an exclusive beach party on a secluded part of the resort property. They loaded groups of us into these open-air golf carts and drove us along narrow, winding paths lit only by tiki torches. It felt surreal, like we were heading into some forgotten corner of the world. I wasn't drinking that night. Someone in the group needed to stay sharp, and I'd volunteered. The party itself was incredible. A bonfire on the sand, fairy lights strung between palm trees, and music blasting from oversized speakers. People were scattered across the sand, dancing and laughing in little groups. That's where I met her. She was standing near the fire with a group of other travelers, 2 guys and another girl. She was stunning, with dark hair and a bright, almost mischievous smile. Throughout the night, our eyes kept meeting. Every time I caught her staring, she'd grin and lean in to whisper something to her friends. Eventually, I worked up the courage to talk to her. "What's your name?" I asked, leaning closer to be heard over the music. She smirked, leaned in until her lips were practically touching my ear, and said, "If I told you, I'd have to kill you." I laughed it off, thinking she was just being playful. The night wore on, and as the party started to wind down around 3 a.m., someone suggested taking a group photo. I had my DSLR camera with me. I loved capturing landscapes and candid shots on trips like these, so I handed it to one of the staff members and asked them to snap a picture. In the photo was me, my friends, the group she was with, and her, standing right next to me, with my arm casually draped over her shoulder. We said our goodbyes, and the carts took us back to the resort. Back in my room, my friend passed out immediately, snoring loud enough to shake the walls, but I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about her, the girl, her smile, that bizarre little joke she'd made. To pass the time, I turned on my camera and started scrolling through the photos. And then I froze. The group photo was there, but the girl wasn't the same. The young, vibrant woman I remembered was replaced by an old woman. Her hair was thin and gray, pulled back into a messy bun. Deep wrinkles carved lines across her face, and her lips were slightly parted as if she were about to say something. But the most horrifying part was her eyes. They weren't warm or playful, they were sharp and cold, staring directly into the camera lens. I dropped the camera, my breath catching in my throat. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely turn the thing off. I shoved it under my bed and sat frozen in place, staring at the floor until the sun began to rise. When morning came, I gathered my friends. They were groggy and half listening as I told them about the picture. I grabbed the camera from under the bed and turned it on. The photo was gone. Every other picture from the night was still there. The bonfire, the dancing, random selfies with strangers. But the group photo had vanished. My friends exchanged nervous glances, and one of them muttered, "Maybe you imagined it, man. You were tired, right?" But I knew what I had seen. Later that day, we went to grab lunch at one of the beachside restaurants. As luck would have it, we ran into the group the girl had been with. The other girl and the 2 guys were sitting at a shaded table, eating tacos and sipping drinks. I walked over, trying to keep my voice casual. "Hey, where's your friend? The girl with the dark hair?" The 3 of them looked at each other, confused. "Oh, her?" one of the guys said. "We actually just met her last night at the party. She said she was studying at some university in California, I think. Or maybe it was Connecticut. I don't know. We didn't get her name." I felt a chill creep up my spine. "You don't know her?" I asked. The other girl shrugged. "Nope. She kind of just showed up and started hanging out with us. Seemed nice, though." I nodded, forcing a weak smile before walking back to my table. The rest of the trip felt hazy after that. I couldn't stop thinking about that photo, the wrinkled face, the sharp eyes, the way she had looked directly at me. I've traveled to other places since then, but I've never felt quite at ease. Whenever someone suggests taking a group picture, I always hesitate for just a moment, because sometimes I think about that old woman's face in the photo and wonder, was she even real? Or was she something else entirely? Something that only existed for one brief night under the flickering glow of a bonfire by the sea. Before the next story, if you're new to the channel, make sure to subscribe so that you don't miss any of these terrifying stories. I was 16 when my parents and I took a trip to Chicago for my dad's birthday. It was one of those rare family vacations where everything seemed to click perfectly. We did all the classic tourist stuff, Millennium Park, the Willis Tower sky deck, deep dish pizza at some famous spot my dad had bookmarked months before. But it's the last day of that trip I can't shake. We were running late for our flight home. After fumbling with our bags and rushing out of the hotel, my dad booked an Uber. I remember him muttering about surge pricing as we waited at the curb. Minutes later, a silver sedan pulled up. The car had multiple Uber and Lyft stickers on the windshield and back windows. Almost too many. Like he was trying to convince us he was legitimate. My dad glanced at his phone, then at the car. I guess in the rush, he didn't check the license plate carefully. The man driving was lanky, wearing a faded hoodie and jeans that looked like they hadn't been washed in weeks. His hair was stringy, and his eyes were sunken. But he gave us a nod and popped the trunk for our luggage. We got in. At first, everything felt normal. My mom asked about the airport, and he mumbled something vague in return. I remember the car smelled faintly of bleach. We drove in silence for about 10 minutes before my dad noticed something odd. The driver didn't have the Uber app open on his phone. It was dark, but I could see his phone screen. No GPS, no map, just a black home screen. "Hey, aren't you supposed to be following the app?" my dad asked. The driver didn't respond. Dad's voice sharpened. "Where are we going?" Still no reply. Instead, the man's hands gripped the steering wheel tighter, and his foot pressed harder on the gas. The car lurched forward, weaving between lanes, speeding past exits. The city lights started to fade behind us. "Stop the car!" my dad shouted. My mom was clutching her rosary, her lips moving in silent prayer. I was frozen in the back seat, my heart pounding so hard it felt like it might burst out of my chest. My hands were trembling, and I remember trying to unbuckle my seatbelt, but my fingers wouldn't work. My dad reached over the seat, grabbed the driver's shoulder and yelled, "Stop this car right now!" The man flinched but didn't stop. He didn't even look back at us. His eyes stayed locked on the road ahead. That's when we heard the sirens. Blue and red lights flashed through the back window, and I nearly cried from relief. The driver glanced in the rearview mirror, his expression flat and unreadable. For a moment, I was terrified he was going to slam his foot down and try to outrun the cops, but instead, he pulled over onto the shoulder. The police swarmed the car in seconds, guns drawn, flashlights blinding us. I was crying. My mom was sobbing into her hands, and my dad was shouting something about kidnapping. The driver didn't resist. He just let them pull him out of the car and handcuff him on the pavement. One officer opened the door and helped us out, his voice calm and steady, telling us we were safe now. Another officer pulled our luggage from the trunk while someone else wrapped my mom in a blanket. I'll never forget standing there on the side of the highway, the flashing lights reflecting off the pavement, the wind whipping through my hair as I stared at the driver. He was kneeling on the ground, staring straight ahead, with that same hollow expression. The police took us to the airport after everything settled down. We sat in silence, clutching our bags, still trembling from adrenaline. Later, one of the officers told my dad quietly, "You're lucky we caught him when we did. He's done this before." That was it. No further explanation. We never found out where he was planning to take us, or what he intended to do. But I have nightmares about it sometimes. About the endless highway stretching ahead. About the cold way he gripped the wheel. And about the smell of bleach lingering in the car. I always double-check the license plate now. Every single time.